Good evening, anarchists everywhere, and welcome to the third in the series, Anarchism in the UK, where I interview anarchists of the freedom past generation. Before I interview today's guest, may I mention the annual Anarchist Book Fair on October the 18th at Queen Mary College in the Mile End Road. A stellar line-up this year, including Lucio Urtubia, the Spanish Robin Hood, last of the great expropriators, so well worth a trip down the Mile End Road. I'm also hoping to interview him the day following the book fair. All the interviews can also be seen on my blog or on YouTube, courtesy of Ray Hulm. Today's guest has led a varied and fascinating life, which rather puts my lifestyle in a one-dimensional framework. Ray Hulm, welcome. Ray told me earlier, the current debate about lifestyle versus class struggle anarchists interests me, as I've always felt I have a foot in both camps. I'm not only proud to be working class, but also proud to be a worker. I'm probably the only old hippie that's into the dignity of labour. Ray, welcome. And how has that sort of manifested itself in your life?
Well, Ian, I think I've been involved in both strands of anarchism over the years, especially in the early days of it, in the late 60s and early 70s. And I always felt strongly that it's important to know whose side you're on. That's the main criteria for everything, as far as I'm concerned. Sure, without a class analysis, nothing is very much use to you. But there's a whole load of other interesting things going on, that people are experimenting, different kinds of lifestyles, and I don't find that a problem. I've never felt a big problem between the two camps. I felt, as you said, I felt I've straddled it. I'll just tell you something about a guy that I used to know in the 70s. I expect we'll maybe talk later on about my time in Devon, but a guy used to come and see us a lot. And he was, I suppose, in many ways, the epitome of what you might class as the lifestyle anarchist, insofar as there was a couple, they had the whole bit, organo, vegetarians, free-range children, all of those fairly predictable things. But that guy was a militant shop steward in the factory that he worked in, yeah, and it wasn't just either or. And I've always felt that that's pretty much where I am, with foot in both camps, yeah. Yeah, I guess seeing people in a one-dimensional way may be a more modern phenomenon. Maybe back in the 60s and 70s, people did sort of straddle both divides. You worked in a boatyard to start off with. Do you want to tell us a bit about your career on boats? It was just purely by accident, actually. I finished my school in Leighton, in East London, and I was in a secondary modern school, second class from the bottom almost all of the time, But, I did like to read. That was the thing. I really did like to read. And there were books at home. So, that gave me an extra incentive to find out about things. But when I was 16, we moved down to Essex, and for the want of anything better to do, I got a job in a boatyard. Now, as an apprentice. Now, I think I was a really bad apprentice boat builder, I have to say. In fact, I've always maintained it was because of me that the industry turned over to fiberglass. But I was in this boatyard, and I was there, must have been for about a year, I suppose, when a boat, this little boat, converted lifeboat, sailed into Brightlingsea. This was the part of Essex where we lived, and it was full of what in those days were known as bohemians. Yeah, well,
not people from Bohemia.
Not people from Bohemia. Although legend has it that a local girl did tell her mum, "There's a load of Bohemians have come in on a boat," and her mum said, "Do they speak English?" But this may not be true. But these were like. What later on became known as hippies and so on. But this was pre-hippies. Yeah, this was 1958, I suppose.
So there's sort of tail end of the beatnik, coffee bar, jazz club kind of culture.
Absolutely, yeah.
And did they whisk you off and kidnap you and take you to Windsor and make you become a hippie?
Precisely. They did just that. I was totally enraptured with this. I'd never met people like it. I'd never met anyone whose horizon went beyond sort of, working in a factory, get enough money to buy a new suit, go down the boozer Saturday night, and I was stunned. And so yes, I ran away with them, and we ended up in Windsor, and I was introduced to this whole new world of I found out about CND, lived over the top of a coffee bar, got a job on a riverboat, had spaghetti not in a tin for the first time in my life. So yeah, it was my horizons were suddenly widened at the age of 17.
And was this the time you were working on barges and riverboats, and it was a sort of you'd sort of come across militant dock workers who were unionised, but the individuality of the bargees didn't really lend itself to organised struggle?
Well, I mean, after I was some while working on a riverboat in Windsor and hanging out in jazz clubs, hanging out with the Bohemians, and then I moved on and I got a job on the Thames barges, and that was, as you say, that was interesting because we spent a lot of time in the London docks. The London docks at the time were a very, very militant workplace. This was the sort of
Jack Dash.
This was the sort of heyday of Jackie Dash. And but the bargemen were a far more individualistic workforce. But strange, I mean, I think I may have told you before him, but strangely enough, I mean, I can remember this old skipper, and he said, if there's a strike, I'll come out on strike. But he wouldn't join a union. But he was prepared to be militant enough to come out on strike, So...
And had you sort of formulated idea? Have you come across anarchism as a political viewpoint by this time, or were you just sort of a natural anarchist, like lots of people in that time became, without knowing there was such a thing as anarchism?
I think that's probably near to the truth, actually. I honestly can't remember when I first came across like formal anarchism. Can't remember when I first read a book about it or anything. But I mean, I think, to be truthful, I was just sort of left-wing, anti-racist. I felt very strongly about race, as I think many of us did of our generation, Ian.
And then there was another sudden change. You suddenly ended up working in the Mediterranean on the boats of the international jet set. How did that come about?
Well, that was sometime later. I mean, when I was a few years on the barges, and I sort of graduated to larger coasters, and I did that for a while, and I mean, I started to meet a lot of wide diversity of people there. I mean, it must seem very strange now to sort of this current generation of anarchists, how we sort of struggle to formulate our ideas or get any ideas, because we didn't know anyone who went to university or anything like that, Ian. And I can remember working on this collier. Now I've got to tell you about this collier. I mean, in the coal trade with no showers. Can you imagine? I mean, and like sort of like in the evening when we got into harbour, before you went ashore, put your suit on and went up the road, you had to boil up a bucket of water on the galley range and have a wash down. You work in the coal trade, And like I can remember having this discussion with this other AB who was just like me, secondary modern boy, left school at 15, about whether Tolstoy was a communist. I mean,
covered in coal dust in the
covered in coal
bath.
dust. They'd been more to the point we'd organised about getting a shower, quite frankly. However, I mean, and there was another guy, the second engineer I always remember was an old Scouser, and he'd fought in the international brigades, and when he went ashore and he had a few pints of Guinness, he always wanted to talk about two things. He either wanted to talk about the defence of Madrid or when he'd worked in Jack Sherry's corner when Jack Sherry had wrestled Man Mountain Dean. I mean, these are the kind of people I've spent my formative years around.
Oh, fantastic.
But anyway, as you say, like by the mid-60s, I guess, I found myself working in the Mediterranean on millionaire yachts.
How did that come about?
It came about because I decided that I wanted to have a spell ashore. Went to South London, got a job in a factory. South London in those days was full of drinking clubs, not all of them legal. And I knew a guy who owned a drinking club, and sort of got quite friendly with him. He said he was going to drive down to Gib. Did I want to come with him? I said, yeah, why not? So went down to Gibraltar. In Gibraltar, running out of money, looked for a ship, and someone offered me a job on a yacht. I didn't even realise that kind of yachting existed. So that was my introduction.
Yeah, you thought it was another collier based in the Costa.
Well, absolutely, yeah. It's a very different world. I'd never met rich people before.
So how long did that last? Well, it must have been quite
I was yachting for 5 years, I think.
Blimey. And then come the late 60s, you suddenly upped and went across to the US and sort of...